So before we broke, you were telling me about the difference in format between a show like McCloud and Columbo.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that.
Well, McCloud was kind of a straight-ahead detective show. It had the dimension of a fish-out-of-water character, of a Western character in New York. That was the essence of the show. Other than that, it was just kind of a straight-ahead police show. Columbo was we used to call it an inverted mystery. And so, it had clues. You know who did it in the beginning, and you're just waiting to see how is he going to catch him. We used to say internally that Columbo had the greatest arrest record and the worst conviction record of any detective in the history of police forces, because usually he'd pull out the finished clue and the villain would say, "Yeah, well, you got me." And that was the end of it.
Then you'd cut. Another show that you worked on in 1975 was McCoy. So did you create McCoy?
Yes, Kibby and I created it, yeah.
And was that the first show you created?
I don't remember. Yeah, I think so. I think that's the first show I actually created.
Do you remember the process that you guys would have gone through to create that show?
Well, we wanted to do a sleuth show, and the notion was to take a character who's a compulsive gambler, who's in trouble, and he goes out and solves a crime where he thinks he has a point of view about what happened so that he can make enough money to pay off the people that he owes and survive.
And who was the star of that show?
Well, initially we wanted to use Patrick McGoohan, and when I was doing Columbo, I had an understanding with NBC that we wouldn't cast anybody they didn't like, and they wouldn't cast anybody we didn't like. And we had a show set in a military school, and just peculiarity abounded in as much as there was really no one name that we could think of. I'd been trying to get Patrick McGoohan onto the show for a long time. I was a great fan of his from The Prisoner. And so I finally talked them into letting him do the show over their objections, but they relented. He went on to win the Emmy for the show, as it turned out, and then got a series himself at Warner Brothers. So that was an example of where the casting really became significant a problem. Usually it wasn't a problem. It was not hard to find someone who would fit the bill. Robert Culp was the sort of preternatural villain on Columbo, because he's everything you want to put Columbo up against. Somebody rich and arrogant and powerful and corrupt against him. Yeah.
That's great. So McCoy only lasted for 5 episodes. Why do you think it didn't get a longer run?
We wrote the script and offered it to Patrick, and I got a call back from his agent saying he doesn't really like the script. So we said, well, that's too bad. So now we go and we look around, we find that Tony Curtis, who was in London, is available and would be interested in doing it. And I was always a great fan of Tony Curtis, because although he started out as kind of a attractive young leading man and all of that, he became a very significant, I felt, and highly skilled actor. I mean, if you look at the summation of all of the films he's done, there's some wonderful pictures there and some wonderful performances. Burt Lancaster was his mentor for a movie called Sweet Smell of Success, where Tony played Sidney Falco, a sycophant to Burt Lancaster's version of a powerful Walter Winchell type character. So we offered the script to Tony. He accepted it. He was in London. I get a call from Patrick's agent, said Patrick would like to come in and talk to you. Now, he'd already turned it down. I said, well, but I know Patrick's kind of eccentric. So I said, okay. So he came in and we talked for a while, and he said, well, I'll do it. And I said, well, it's very awkward, Patrick. The word we got back from your agent was you didn't like the script, which we translated into you're not wanting to do the show, and we've already made an offer to another actor. So it was a very awkward meeting, and Patrick left, but we had Tony. And Tony, who's maybe one of the most malleable actors in the history of film, called me up and he said, you know, there's a scene in the beginning of the script. He's in London, I know it. And the scene had to do with the fact that he was calling his ex-wife because he was in trouble for money and trying to borrow some money from her. So this meant, you know, he was kind of in a cheap hotel room calling her. She's married to a dentist or someone. And he said, I got an idea about that scene. I said, really, what's that? He said, well, I don't really want to talk to her, so I think I could play it standing and taking a shower. And I just put the phone on the toilet by the shower. And occasionally I'd say, yeah, 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 and hang up. Now, of course, this is antithetical to what the scene is about, and I panicked when I heard this. I thought, oh my God, I hadn't done that much directing, and Tony's a big star, so what am I going to do? And I said, well, why don't we talk when you get back to LA? So I went over to Burt Lancaster's office, and whom I knew, and I said, here's what happened. And Burt thought about it, and he said, you know, he's much more afraid of you than you are of him. And Tony showed up, and then on the first day we're shooting, we were down in San Pedro. We have to photograph an oil tanker. You got to get it because oil tankers don't sit around. You have to delouse them in the fire department, and they go away. And it was a very simple shot. You just showed the tanker, and you kind of dollied back, and there was Tony and Brenda Vaccaro, who was the co-star, and they sort of fold into a two-shot. And I noticed Tony's got this hat on, and the hat is sort of like a forest ranger in Canada would wear. And I'm looking at the hat, and I said to him, we were getting ready to shoot, I said, Tony, the hat, you see how great, isn't it? I said, it is. I said, it is, but I don't really think it's quite right for this scene. He said, really? I said, yeah. Took the hat and tossed it away. We went on from there, and he couldn't have been nicer about everything. In fact, it got to the point where I could block out a scene without him, and he would come in and say, oh, great, it's all done, you know? And after about halfway through, he would come up and he'd take my hand and he'd kiss the back of my hand and say, how are we today, dear boy? You know? He had a great time. He loved to get a little joke in between the time you said cut and you said print. This was part of his fun that he had with things. And so we ran it at what was called ASI, which they used to test films and movies where people had a dial, you know, and they'd have to, if they're liking it, they turn it up and down. So we're sitting up in their booth watching these numbers roll around, you know, if they like it or not. And when it's over, it turned out it got one of the highest rated numbers at ASI that they'd ever gotten. So the next morning, studio calls us and said, we've sold 4 two-hour movies to NBC. I said, great. We would go over to NBC the next morning, and the head of their research, who later became head of programming, said it went very well, some of the highest numbers we've ever gotten testing a pilot. However, and they love Larry Hagman, and they love Brenda Vaccaro, but they really don't like Tony Curtis. And I said, well, Larry Hagman is going to be gone, and Brenda's going to be gone, and Tony's the star of the show. Why are we making these? He said, well, we have a deal and it's all set. So we went back and we made 4 of them. And it was like everybody on the lot knew this show is a dead show. It was a strange experience. So we're making a show we know is not going to last, so we just did the best we could. We made the 4 and it went away. But Tony was a lovely man and a real artist, by the way, as a writer and as a painter.
So you directed the big ripoff.
Yeah, that was the pilot.
Yeah. Was directing something you wanted to do more of?
Yes, it was, because I went to film school, and I shot some film back there for varsity shows and whatnot, and I came to UCLA and all of that. So yeah, I wanted to do a film, so I took my friend Gabe Dell, who was a very interesting and kind of colorful actor, and I wrote 4 sketches. And on weekends I'd go out and I'd shoot one of these in 16 millimeter. And I got some pretty good actors doing them, just to make my mistakes. Because if I should get so lucky that somebody's going to finance this oddball movie that I want to make, I don't want to screw up as little as possible. So we did them on weekends, and I had I had Brenda Vaccaro, and I had Nick Colasano, who played Coach on Cheers, and Alan Garfield, and Hunt Hall and Jackie Coogan. And they were amusing, you know. I could have done more of them. And John Voight wanted to do one, Peter wanted to do one, but I can't afford to just keep making these on my own, which are not going to go anywhere at that time. And I didn't even really have the money to do proper post-production on them. So that kind of went away, but I wanted to do this script that Gabe and I had worked on called the Manchu Eagle Murder Caper Mystery. And my agent at the time actually was my lawyer who sent the script back to United Artists, and they read it. It cost nothing. It cost $375,000 was the budget. And they sort of said, and this is in the 60s or early 70s, where the people would make movies and say, well, why not? You know, it doesn't cost anything. So they said, okay, do it. And they didn't ask me who was in it. In fact, the head of the company said, when you figure out who you're casting, just send me a note and let me know who's in it. So we had Will Geer and Barbara Harris and Gabe Dell and Hunt Hall and Nick Colasano and Dick Gautier and Vince Gardenia. We had a really nice cast. My whole cast budget was $31,000. But it was off season, and I had designed to do it off season because I know nobody's going to be working. But they liked the script because it was a fairly amusing, oddball movie, which, as I mentioned to you earlier, we just ran back in New York at the Film Forum. And so I had the script, and then on a Monday morning, they closed the deal. Monday night, I go to the Hilton where there's a strike meeting going on for the Writers Guild, and they say, okay, we're going out. And they read off all of the struck companies, and I'm listening, and I don't hear United Artists. So I go to the president of the guild, and I say, you're not striking United Artists? He said, no, we don't have an MBA with United Artists. They don't hire writers. They're a production distribution facility. I said, well, what do I do? He said, go make your movie. So the next morning I opened production offices and we went off and we shot this odd little film, which I won't take up. This could be a 6-hour interview if I had to go through all of what happened on that movie. But it had kind of a happy ending when the guy who runs the Film Forum saw it and put together a running of it back there, which was very successful. And on the basis of that, I'm now going to do a dance evening with the dance short that I've done for tap dancing and the biography of dancers with some live tap entertainment. And that's going to be sometime in June. We're going to go back and do that. So this thing has sort of had a legacy, if you will, or a kind of a life that's kept going that's been very satisfying.
That's so great. I love that. So in 1985, you executive produced 30 Perry Mason movies.
I think it was 1985 when we began. Fred had made a deal with Raymond Burr, with the Perry Mason estate, and with NBC to do a Perry Mason movie. I was at Viacom at the time. I hadn't had a hit in a few years. And he said, would you come in and write the script and be my fellow executive producer? And I wasn't even sure that I liked Perry Mason that much. I always thought they were kind of cockamamie stories and that. And I wasn't really a fan of the original show. But I needed a successful show. So I looked at a couple of episodes and I had some ideas. And so wrote a script and we sent it over to NBC on a Friday. And on Monday, the development guy at Viacom came in and said, they've greenlit the script. I said, that's not possible. I haven't heard from them. I haven't gotten a note. He said, no, it's greenlit. I said, you've got to be kidding me. So I called the guy who ran movies, who used to be my agent. He was a very funny guy. He used to be one of the Groundlings, you know, which is this improv group there. And I said, Steve, I said, I'm very happy you picked it up. He said, yeah. I said, why? I mean, I'm just curious. He said, well, I read 5 scripts over the weekend, and yours is the only one that made any sense. And so we go back and we start shooting Perry Mason. And we're shooting in Toronto. And I don't know, does anybody really want to see this again? You know, it's been a long time. But the Toronto, I think it's the Globe and Mail, which is like their New York Times, does a full page with Barbara you know, and Raymond and the courtroom and that. I mean, it's a big piece. Now, this is not a town where it's news that a movie comes there because they shoot a lot of movies. So I looked at this, I said, well, maybe people do want to see this. So they held back Time magazine and all of these things to the air date. It goes on the air, and to my astonishment, it's the #1 movie of the night. It's the #1 movie of the week. It's the #1, and there were 250 movies that year. The #1 movie of the month, and the #1 movie of the year. They ordered the second one just after we finished the first one, and we went on, and I think we did 4 or 5 a year. We did 33 of them. We did 3 of them after Raymond died. The fiction was that evidently when he did the old show and he needed a rest, they'd bill it as a Perry Mason mystery, and they'd bring in some guest star to take the thing. So we used that. We had Paul Sorvino come in to do one, and Hal Holbrook did 2. Then the guy from distribution said, we can't make any more of these. He said, I'm selling them overseas, and everybody says, where's Raymond Burr? Because Raymond passed away by that point. So yes, that's how we did 33 of those.
How did you guys get Raymond Burr to agree to do it?
Well, Raymond hadn't been doing that much either, you know. I mean, he'd had Ironsides, which was a big hit for him, as well as Perry Mason. And Raymond was a real actor. He loved to work. And, you know, he had great success with the original series. And he just jumped into it. He was eager. And also a very, very nice man. I always liked Raymond. He was sort of a loon in some ways. He had a mythology about himself, which is, how can I say it, our current president, you know, has a mythology about himself that's subject to a lot of variation. Raymond was not unlike that, although Raymond was a very nice guy.
I heard he was a practical joker, too.
I guess so. Not so much on the movies. I think when it was his show and he was doing 1 an hour, I think to relieve the boredom. But Raymond was huge. I mean, the wardrobe man held up his belt once for a photo, and it was like he was holding an anaconda. And he was always saying to me, next time you see me, I'm going to lose 50 pounds. Well, he may have, but you couldn't tell. But he was a charming guy, and we used to have our script meetings with him as we'd meet him somewhere, here or San Francisco, and he'd have a yellow tablet with numbers on it, page numbers, and we'd sit there and we'd go through them. Raymond loved wine. He has a winery. It's still left in his name, which is pretty good. But he loved his white wine, and we'd go to his hotel suite. He was there with his partner, and there'd be several bottles of white wine laid out. And he'd start going through these and marking them off. And they were never much of anything, really, but it was sort of the ceremony was what was important for Raymond. He was being heard. And then we'd go to some restaurant because he was a gourmand at that time. And then he'd just go off and shoot it. You never hear a word from him until it was time to do the next one.
That's so cool. So now, was this your first time working with Fred Silverman?
Yes, on Perry Mason.
And what were your impressions of him?
Well, Fred had a reputation going into this. He obviously was a giant in television programming. He made CBS into a huge success. He did the same thing with ABC, and then things didn't go so well at NBC. And so he left that position, decided to go into independent production, for which he really didn't have much experience. And it was kind of a rough road for him to begin with. He tried to show with Alan Thicke and maybe a couple of other things that never really stuck. So, but always being inventive and very smart. Fred's very smart. He has a certain kind of genius that's very unique. And he went out and he got Raymond Burr and he got the rights and he put this together. And all of a sudden, there's Perry Mason. Then he came to me because they'd had a writer, and Brandon Tartikoff, who was running NBC, who was basically mentored by Fred. I mean, Fred kind of created him in a sense. I once asked him, I said, what was it you saw in Brandon Tartikoff that you elevated him to these high positions? He said, nothing. I said, I'd fired everybody else. He was the only one left. Fred was not long on sentiment. But we started, when he came into my office, I got Perry Mason, would you want to do it? And I thought, well, I better, And it went off to be a success. Then he had talked to Brandon about doing a show with Andy Griffith. Andy Griffith, I think, was in a 2-hour movie called Fatal Vision, in which he played a prosecutor. When you first meet him, he's clipping his toenails at his desk. And I guess they said, we have to have this on television. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, there's some famous defense attorneys that are very colorful, like Racehorse Haynes and Percy Foreman, Texas guys. Percy Foreman never lost a murder case, and he was a very colorful and interesting guy. And he always got paid up front. And I stole one of his speeches once to a client where in the pilot, Matlock says to this guy, so how much money you got? And he said, well, I don't know. How much? He said, well, I don't know, maybe 150,000. I'll do as a retainer. He says, retainer? He said, listen. He says, if I succeed, I'm worth every cent. And if I fail, they're going to take you down to Jackson and electrocute you. You haven't lost anything. And, you know, it just fit. I had a lot of great material from these guys that I put into the pilot. And the pilot was very, very successful. Andy was great in it. Andy was a sensational actor. Most people didn't give him credit. They remember him from Mayberry. But if you go back into his history, you'll see that he did a movie called A Face in the Crowd, which was him playing himself, basically. He was a guy who was in jail, a drunk, and they pull him out as a kind of folksy spokesman, and they put him on television, and this kind of good old country boy thing makes him into a huge star. That's Andy Griffith. He then went on to Broadway. He originally wanted to be a singer, but his voice coach told him, he says, your voice is so brilliant, it's almost unpleasant to listen to. So he decided to go into comedy. He developed an idea which was called What It Was Football, about a hillbilly coming home and trying to explain football to some hillbillies who've never seen a game. And of course, immediately, you know, the disconnect between these two worlds got him comedy. And he milked that for quite a while. What it was opera. I mean, he did a lot of this. Then he did No Time for Sergeants on Broadway, did the movie. And then Sheldon Leonard put him in Mayberry, you know, which became the Andy Griffith Show. And that really made him. He was a massive success on that. Fred's real genius, I thought, was the fact that, as he articulated to me, he said, you know, many times what happens with pilots is they go haywire with the casting. Everybody's kind of maybe looking for the same guy, and you wind up with somebody and you compromise and it doesn't work. He said, what we need to do is to start with the casting, find a star, somebody who's already welcome in people's homes, and then design a show for that. So I said to myself, well then what we need to do is to deliver enough humor in the show so that people like Andy for that will get that, plus they'll get the mystery show, which is how we did it with Andy. We did it with Bill Conrad, Tom Bosley, Dick Van Dyke, and it worked. You know, that I think was Fred's real contribution to those shows, other than the fact that most of the people that we were selling to were people who'd worked for him, all of whom had stories about Fred, because Fred could be very colorful in his own way. One of the guys at NBC said that two executives came into Fred's office one day and said, you know, you fired 52 vice presidents. Fred said, that's not true. He said, no, you have. You fired. I don't believe it. I want to see the paperwork. I want to see the names of those 52 people that you say I fired. They come back with a name and he fires them. So, you know, and because he really didn't understand production in the beginning. There was time when we were doing the Perry Mason, the first one, that he was in here and I was back in Toronto with the crew, and he got very upset and started yelling about the fact that the set looked so fake. Of course, it was an actual courtroom, so there was a learning curve for Fred, getting into television. His instincts were quite amazing because, as Kerry McCluggage, who used to run Paramount, said to me once, he said, the thing about Fred is that Fred will have 20 ideas. 2 of them will be brilliant, 2 of them will be pretty good, and there's a descending scale down to not good at all, and he will pursue all of them with the same enthusiasm. And that was part of his charm and part of his genius. He was originally called the man with the golden gut. His instincts about things were really wonderful. He could be eccentric, he could be difficult, but he had a genius, and that's the genius that, you know, made these shows begin. And it was his concept that made them work. You know, I was lucky enough to be included in all of this, to pull my part of the wagon. And so I'm very indebted to Fred for that. I would be living in this very nice house if it wasn't for Fred Silverman. I was doing okay, you know, throughout my career, but, you know, this was like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was a sea change for me. Getting involved with Fred and Perry Mason changed my entire life. So I always try to thank Fred for that and make sure that he gets proper credit. A lot of people will tell you a lot of interesting anecdotes about Fred, and there are many of them. But at the heart of everything, Fred had a genius, and that's why he's Fred Silverman.
Right. So talk about writing that first Perry Mason movie, Perry Mason Returns, and did you follow the model of the original? Were you able to add new elements to it?
When you say the original, you mean the series?
The original series, yeah.
The major change that we made was bringing in Bill Catt, who was Barbara Hale's son, to play the detective in the show. Bill didn't want to do it to begin with. In fact, he was rather hostile to the idea and said to me in a meeting, "I'm only doing this because of Raymond." And that was okay with me, as long as he did it. But once he got into it, he was great. You know, he was a very talented and handsome guy, and did a good job on the show. Wanted to move on to other things, and we brought in Billy Moses, who took over that function in the show, and he did, I think, all of them after that. I think Bill Catt did maybe 5 or 6. I'm not sure. And Billy Moses is a wonderful guy, and he brought a kind of warmth and humanity to the character.
And talk about Barbara Hale. Talk about working with her.
Barbara Hale is perfect. I mean, you can't find anyone who has anything bad to say about Barbara Hale. Certainly not me. I mean, she had some physical problems. In fact, she couldn't walk well when we did the pilot. So you're always taking, you know, the camera goes over to her, you know. I mean, Raymond had a lot of physical problems when he was doing the thing. So a lot of times you're bringing the camera to Raymond, or Raymond is going here. You have to kind of fudge the fact that until he gets up near the bench and really goes into the cross-examination, he's not very mobile. But he hit it. He also did everything off of off a teleprompter, not cue cards, a teleprompter. And he was perfect. And he did it, I mean, you couldn't tell. And I remembered at the time when we first started that I'd read a thing about John Ford and John Wayne. And Ford always said about John Wayne, "The Duke speaks in headlines." So I thought, that's a pretty good lesson for Raymond and me. I never said this to Raymond, by the way. But so what I did was I would write everything so that he's essentially, you know, he bangs everything out. He'll have a soft moment here and then. But when he gets into where were you, and isn't it true that, and all of that, he just banged those things out, and they were headlines, and he was tremendously effective. He could play the other part too, you know, he could play some emotion in that, but that was the center of what he did. And Bill Conrad was the same way. Bill Conrad prided himself in Jake the Fat Man. First of all, he says he'd done Cannon, where he was playing a detective. He said, "Well, the good thing about this show is I don't have to hold my stomach in," because he's playing the fat man. He was another very nice guy, and very skilled. He conducted orchestras and symphonies around the country towards the end of his life. He ran B movies at Warner Brothers. He was a very erudite and educated guy. He essentially was a vocalization because he was Matt Dillon on radio before he got into television. And he had a great sense of humor and was a lot of fun to work with. First time we brought Joe Penny in for a little sit around the table. Joe is an actor I was a big fan of. Joe was sitting there, he was smoking, he was a little anxious. And we were just sitting around, it was Fred and myself and the director and Conrad and Joe. And at one point, Joe says to Bill, "Listen, Bill, I know about the cards. That's great. You know, that's great. It's not a problem. Not great. But you know, sometimes I like to ad lib or work my way around the dialogue and this and that. And Conrad said, well, when you finish, just nod. But they got along great, you know, because they had regards for each other. And they had a nice chemistry together. It was a weird show because it became a different show every year. I mean, we did the first year trying to do a slightly noirish show. All of the titles of the episodes were song titles, which was kind of effective, except when you try to remember which show is which, it wasn't like, well, it was the Professor show. You have to remember which song title matched which show. And it wasn't a great success in the rating, but CBS has always liked to have a show in Hawaii. So the second year, they picked the show up on the condition that we would go to Hawaii. I think we were there for 2 years. Joe didn't like Hawaii, and he felt confined, I don't know. He had a lot of emotional problems with that. So finally the show comes back, and it goes to Long Beach. And so, but it makes a difference in the tonality of the show where you are. So the show starts changing. And also we had a different showrunner every year on the show for various reasons. And the show went for 5 years. It could have gone on more, it did well, but most of us who were working on the show said, I don't know if we want to do this anymore. You know, we like the show and we like the guys, but it's just kind of a strain, you know, to do. So, and we had other things to do, so we had the luxury of not pursuing that. Then went to Dick Van Dyke and and again it was Fred, he says, you know, Dick Van Dyke needs a series. So we said, well, okay, let's make him a doctor, and who solves crimes. And that's what we did, and that show ran for, I don't know, 9 or 10 years. And would have kept on running, except I don't know if I mentioned to you about the demographics on the show.
Say it again, yeah.
The demographics on Diagnosis Murder were very bad. CBS at that particular time had the worst demographics, meaning the oldest audience, on television. We had the worst demographics on CBS, which meant we had the worst demographics on television. But it had a big household number. A lot of people watched the show. They weren't necessarily the audience that CBS wanted. Some of them were in there. So finally, after, I think it was maybe the 10th, either the 9th or the 10th year, CBS says, we got to stop this. So they canceled the show and they started bringing in and retooling the show successfully with CSI and shows that had much more appeal to a younger audience.
What do you think about shows like CSI?
Well, I think they're very well done. I personally prefer a show that has a character at the center that I get interested in. Otherwise, you're just relying on mechanics, and that can work for a while, and it certainly worked very well for CSI. You know, it's a puzzle show, and people like that. But as I think I may have mentioned earlier, in recent times, my favorite show was a show called Luther with Idris Elba, because he was such a great character. And so that's been kind of where my viewing habits have gone, you know, in these times. I'm not a great fan of high concept shows unless they have some interesting characters in them.
I want to go back to Perry Mason for a minute. So why, you did so many of them, why wasn't it a series? Why did you continue to do them as standalone movies?
Well, they were easier on Raymond. I mean, trying to get Raymond to go back into the hour series business, where at one point he had to live on the studio lot, was just more than he wanted to do. I mean, he wasn't a young man. This gives him air, it gives him time off between movies, and we would write the shows so that he would be intercut with action sequences, so in the schedule he had time off. Then he had time off between the movies. So it's much better for him, and that's really why we did it that way.
And talk a little bit about writing a courtroom drama. Did you bring in legal consultants for accuracy?
Yes. I had a legal consultant as my brother-in-law, Dennis Smith. And basically what I do is, you know, after a while you kind of get how it should be, although, you know, we screw things up constantly. He would actually take the courtroom scenes and rewrite them many times. He was invaluable to the show.
That's so cool. What do you?
He's an attorney, by the way. I may not have mentioned that.
I figured, yeah. So tell us about shooting Raymond Burr's last episode, last TV movie, which was The Case of the Killer Kiss. What do you recall about shooting that?
Nothing in particular. I mean, it was another movie. There was nothing about it where we were putting any kind of emphasis on saying goodbye to the audience or any of that. We just did another show. Also, you never know the release order of shows. So this could have been, if you did a goodbye show and there's still 4 shows left, it's a little awkward.
And then he passed away in 1993. How did that impact the movies, and how did you guys decide to continue with the other actors?
Well, the studio obviously wanted to keep Perry Mason running forever. So once Raymond passed away, fairly quickly, they said, let's put together some movies with, and call them Perry Mason Mysteries, with, as I mentioned earlier, Hal Holbrook doing 2 and Paul Sorvino doing 1.
So we started to talk a little bit about Matlock, and you mentioned how you and Fred Silverman worked together in kind of creating and producing these shows, but Viacom was also a producing partner.
Viacom was the studio.
Okay.
They financed it. They put up the deficit financing. They owned the distribution. We were fiduciary partners in a sense that we had a piece of the show in one way or another. But they were the studio. They could have been MGM or Fox or anybody. They performed the same function.
And then you talked about creating the show specifically for Andy Griffith. Did you approach him? How did you get Andy on the show?
Andy was in a 2-hour movie called Fatal Vision, which Brandon Tartikoff had seen and wanted to do a show with Andy, a father-daughter show basically. And he and Fred were very close. They talked about doing it. They got together with a writer, and I'm not disclosing who it is only because I can't remember. And it just didn't work out. So I just done the Perry Mason, which was a big success, so they turned to me. And then I created the show. And the show started out, the pilot went on, it had a 28 share. Now these numbers are like fantasy numbers today. And by the time the head of the studio got to New York, we were at a 33 share, something like that. It was automatic. They just scheduled the show.
There were a lot of people in the cast over the years. One person that we wanted to touch upon was Don Knotts, who had a role in the show for a couple of seasons. Can you talk about bringing him onto the show to play Les Calhoun?
Well, that's Andy. I mean, we all tend to go to things that make us comfortable. And Andy, of course, being essentially a comic, and it had such great success, and loved Don, and Don, he sort of mentored Don in many ways, wanted him on the show, and that was the way it worked, so he got brought in on the show.
You also worked with a kind of core group of writers over the course of this show and other shows during that time. Can you talk about some of those people and how you went about assembling that team?
Well, the central writer-producer on the show, because by now, after the first 4 seasons, I'm off doing other things. I'm kind of keeping an eye on it, but I'm not doing the day-to-day hard work. A fellow named Joel Steiger, who had come and worked with me before, I brought him on as my right hand. He eventually took over the show as executive producer, and he brought in a couple of writers. As I mentioned earlier, I think Joyce Burdett and Gary Conway came in. Other than that, there weren't any real staff writers on the show. Most of the material, in terms of the story material, was generated in-house because, these shows are highly formulaic. I mean, I once brought a writer out from New York who was a very good writer, and I started telling him, here's what happens in a Perry Mason. And I told him scene by scene what had to happen at what point. As I finished, I realized, you just sort of have to fill in the blanks. The formula is so clear. And I think there's a certain kind of familiarity that people like with mysteries. Women, I think, are the biggest audiences for mysteries, probably categorically. My mother was a huge mystery fan. That's all she ever read. And she read them with a box load. I never really cared that much for mysteries. I always liked suspense. I mean, I prefer Hitchcock, which is not a mystery, it's a suspense, as opposed to, shows others that are just mysteries. Mystery is somebody with a gun coming out behind a drape, or something that's always by.
What do you think about mysteries is so appealing to an audience?
Puzzle. They like to guess. They like to guess who done it. I think it's pretty much that simple. I mean, in books, there are dozens of mystery books out with characters, and many writers write under two different names. Earl Stanley Gardner wrote in the name of A.A. Fair. I mean, Nora Roberts has got it in the name. My wife is a huge mystery fan, and she devours these books, and she knows all of these authors. And I don't tend to do that. I tend to read nonfiction.
So why create so many mysteries shows if that wasn't necessarily what you were interested in?
Well, there was a demand. I mean, you do one, and then they want another, and you give them another. Knowing at some point your string's going to run out, which it did, as it always did. But then I created 3 shows for the Hallmark Channel after that, when I was under contract to Sony International Television. And those were doing well, and then there was the collapse in 2008, and they fired all the executives. They stopped making those kind of movies. They're back making Hallmark, I guess, making mystery movies, which are totally female-oriented. There's a gardener who solves crimes. There's a baker who solves crimes. They've sort of tapped into that.
When Matlock was first on the air, it started on NBC.
Correct.
So talk about working with NBC. Did they give you a lot of notes? Was there censorship?
Hardly any. No, because the show was working, and in those days, if you got a show that's working, with a 30 share, which today, an unheard of number, they left you alone. And the studio didn't bother you unless all of a sudden you were going way over budget and there was a financial issue. We didn't get notes from anyone on any of those shows, yeah.
And then the show moved to ABC, so why did that happen, and were there significant changes made to the show at that point?
Not really. I can't remember. Well, we did 2 shows that went to ABC. Father Dowling went to ABC, and Matlock went there. I think because, they were probably thinking maybe Matlock has come to the end of its string. Numbers tend to get lower. So they bought the show. Father Dowling, which NBC dropped and put in Baywatch, certainly a different demographic. No one thought about trying to sell it anywhere else, but ABC called up, and they liked the show. They thought it was well written and well done, and I think we were there for a couple of years.
What do you think is the legacy of Matlock?
Well, the only thing I don't know if it's accurately a legacy, but it used to be, and I know this from my wife who reads all of these mystery books, it used to be that when somebody would make a passing reference to a lawyer sleuth, they would mention Perry Mason. Now they mention Matlock. So you see the name, the reference to him throughout a lot of these sort of pulpy and detective mysteries.
Absolutely.
I think somebody could probably do another Matlock now if they could find the right point of view and the right performer. So at some point, because a couple of people have asked me, said, well, why don't you redo that? They're redoing everything else. My answer to that is, I don't know that I want to do a 22-episode show. It is a tremendous amount of work. I mean, it's weekends and nights and all of that stuff. And there's huge rewards for doing that, don't misunderstand me. But I don't know if I really want to. But today, because a series can be 4 episodes, 6 episodes, 8 episodes. I've had a couple of conversations about maybe looking into that venue again, because that would be a whole lot easier,
Right, that'd be great. So you've spoken about Jake and the Fat Man. So Jake and the Fat Man was actually a spin-off from Matlock.
Yes.
So how do you know when a character is right for a spin-off, and how do you know someone like William Conrad is the right person to be in that show?
Well, part of Fred's genius was to find a performer and design a show for the performer. So it wasn't like, is Bill Conrad appropriate or the right guy for this? It is for Bill Conrad. We've written it, we've designed it for him on all of those shows, whether it was Andy or Bill Conrad or Tom Bosley or Dick Van Dyke, because as I think I mentioned earlier, part of Fred's approach, which was so good and made these shows work so well, was that he'd take someone who was already welcome in people's homes and they liked them, and you put them in a new venue, you try to keep the humor that they liked to begin with, and it worked like a charm.
So you had already had the concept for Jake and the Fat Man, and then was it a backdoor pilot where you then had the Matlock episodes just to launch the series?
Well, in that particular case, Fred came in one day and he says, you know, there's another series in Bill Conrad. I said, okay. So we said, well, what should we do? And I said, well, how about a DA, and then we'll give him an investigator. And so, you know, Bill was locked in immediately, and we could write to him. And then Joe Penny was cast in the part. We didn't write the part for Joe Penny, but Joe was very good at it, yeah.
Yeah. So in 1989, you and Joel Steiger co-created the Father Dowling Mysteries, which you've talked a little bit about. But talk a bit more about developing that show and how it came about.
There was Father Brown was the initial, or the quintessential British detective, you know, the kind of gentle sort of thing. And we couldn't get the rights to Father Brown. So Fred or somebody found a book called Father Dowling, a priest sleuth. And I took the book and I looked at it and I read the dust jacket and I said, well, this isn't going to work. So we'll just buy it and keep the title, which we did. And then I created the show. And the guy who worked with me on that primarily was Donald Westlake, who was a very well-known writer who wrote many series of mysteries and a lot of very good movies, including The Grifters and The Hot Rock and that. And Donald had a great sense of humor, and it was a lot of fun. So he made real contributions to the show.
How did the 1988 writer's strike affect the premiere? Do you remember?
Of what?
Of Father Dowling. There was a writer's strike in 1988.
I don't remember exactly if it had any effect. I don't. The strikes are usually in the spring, so it probably delayed the premiere. It would have to, because, you know, you would have had the script order to do the pilot. And actually, we did a 2-hour pilot for Father Dowling. That's how it started. And that played, and then at some point, and I can't remember exactly when it was, when the strike was over, they said, okay, go, let's do this. And we did 6 episodes of Father Dowling, and it did okay. And then Donald came in and worked on it with us, and I think the show improved. It was in some ways my favorite show, the ones that we did, because I liked the humor in the show. And he and Tracy Nelson were wonderful together. I thought I just enjoyed them. Tracy is a very, very nice woman with a great sense of humor. She was always hard to get a hold of. I mean, production could reach her, but if I needed to talk to her, I'd call, I'd leave messages, she wouldn't call me back. And she was very sweet and eccentric. There was no hostility about it. Finally, I left her a message and I said, you know, Tracy, I might as well put a message in a bottle and drop it off the Santa Monica Pier to try to get your attention to have you call me. And a few hours later, she called me. She said, I was walking by the Santa Monica Pier and I picked up this bottle. So I thought I'd better call you.
That's awesome. And talk about Tom Bosley. What was he like to work with?
Tom was a very sweet man. I mean, he's just what you saw. Remember, we've done several episodes of the show, and I got the message that Tom and Tracy wanted to see us. I thought, well, here we go. You know, we're going to have a series of complaints or adjustments. Something's going to happen. They came into our office, and Tom said, you know, we came in because we just wanted to tell you how much we appreciate the writing on the show and the scripts and how much we enjoyed doing the show. That's Tom Bosley.
That's amazing. Did writing for a religious main character present any issues?
No, there's no religiosity in the show at all. I mean, we'd have him perform as a priest, obviously, but no, we never got into that.
Even toward the end of the series, there were some episodes where you kind of had more like angels and devils.
Well, we did a show about an angel, and because an actor friend of mine named Jim McKeechin, who I've had a long history with, is a very amusing guy, and so talking to Jim, and I thought, well, making him a reprobate angel could be very amusing. So that's how that show came about. It should have become a series because it had the legs, I felt, to do that, but there wasn't that sufficient interest.
Was there any censorship on that show?
No.
Yeah. And why was it finally canceled in 1991?
Father Dowling?
Yeah.
Just run its course. They had other things. Again, you're dealing with demographics. And when you look at these shows, you have to think about that. I mean, I created 3 shows for the Hallmark Channel because the demographics were perfect. They're all older people. They like these kind of shows. I did a show with John LaRoquette, one with Leah Thompson, and created one for Dick Van Dyke. Because I'd done the first 2, and then I got a call from Dick Van Dyke's wife. And he was friendly with John LaRoquette, still is. And he said, why can't Dick do one of those shows? And I said, well, you've got to understand, Michelle, this is cable. This is not television money. She said, well, I don't care about that. I just want him out of the house. So I came up with an idea of him as a kind of absent-minded professor. And when I pitched it to him, he liked it. Dick was always very amenable. And I was working at Sony overseas at the same time, so I was splitting my efforts. And I came back at one point, and I called the guys at Hallmark and said, what happened on the Dick Van Dyke thing? And they said, well, we couldn't make a deal. I mean, it was just impossible. I thought it was the money or something. So I called Dick and I said, I'm sorry, if you wasted your time doing this. And I thought I explained to Michelle, there's going to be different conditions. He said, no, that's not a problem. He said, they wouldn't give me my nap. I said, what? They wouldn't give me my nap. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, there's only a half-hour break for lunch. I said, but Dick, you're the first one through the line. The half hour doesn't start till the last person goes through the line. You get the same amount of time you got on the CBS show. You can take your nap. So once that was solved, they went on and started making episodes until the bottom fell out, and 2008 hit, and then everything just stopped.
Tough negotiator.
Yeah.
So prior to that show being canceled, to Father Dowling being canceled, you had 5 shows on the air simultaneously. You had Perry Mason, Matlock, Jake and the Fat Man, Father Dowling Mysteries, and Max Monroe, who's canon. Yeah. So how did you balance all of those, and how involved were you day to day on each of them?
Well, if you start with the first one, I was on Matlock actively on a day-to-day basis, I think for maybe 4 years. And then we start weaving in with Jake and the Fat Man, and you promote from within. So I'd spend a year or more actively doing the show, and then I'd have somebody who could come in and take over the reins. And I'd kind of keep a general eye on things like that, but I wasn't doing the dirty work at that point. There were other people doing that.
Right. And how did you make sure each of those shows stayed distinct?
Well, I think it's built into the show. They're all highly formalized. The characters are highly defined. And it's very seldom when you bring in a producer that he's going to try to, improve the show into something else that it isn't. I did have that on Jake and the Fat Man once with a producer who came in, who had very good credits. And he started out by saying, I want to make a change here. I want to start out with their relationship being, not a happy one, and then see them grow together as a character. And I said, oh, okay. So he wrote it, and we shot it, and the show starts off, and it's like they hate each other. And I said, you're not going to bring these 2 people back together. And the next year, we just forget that they didn't like each other and put it back the way it was. And they did, and it went on.
Did you like writing that kind of formula? You've said it's a very formulaic style, these mystery shows. Did you like that kind of writing?
Yeah, I enjoyed it, you know, because they're puzzles. They're doing puzzles, and part of the task is to make every show seem different to some extent. You have to put it in a different arena. You have to put in different kinds of villains and, you know, venues so that it doesn't look like the same show every week, although it pretty much is. We got a call, and on Perry Mason, we'd get some interesting phone calls. Wasn't long ago, my line producer called me and he said, you know, it's come out that Donald Trump is very famous, or has been famous, for calling people for things, posing as his press agent. And he said, we got a phone call from a guy saying he was Donald Trump's press agent. Would we like to star him in a Perry Mason? And my producer came into my office, and nobody knew really who the hell he was at that point. And Donald Trump, I said, why would we do that? So we passed on it, thank God. But I shouldn't say that. You may have to cut that out.
Yeah, you're not the only person
Yeah,
who would have
I
that
can't
reaction.
imagine I'm the only one who's mentioned that.
Wow, that's fascinating. You mentioned that, you know, the shows had a core demographic that was older.
Mhm.
Why do you think that audience is so attracted to these kinds of shows?
Probably familiarity. You're dealing with stars that they're already comfortable with. You know, mysteries as a general rule tend to skew older. You know, there's nothing very hip about any of these shows that's going to appeal necessarily to a younger demographic. You know, they're not, there's no violence, they're not fast paced. I mean, you know, you could sit there and kind of absorb the show at your leisure. And older demographic, it was just a show that they liked. And also they were an underserved audience, because networks traditionally don't like that audience. CBS was stuck with this because they were the original network. So they were in all these C&D counties. And so they serviced that for a very long time with the Andy Griffith Show and with, you know, the Beverly Hillbillies and things like that. So it was their curse and their blessing at the same time. They did very well in household numbers. But Fred was one of the ones, although he won't admit it, because he canceled, or he and someone canceled the Andy Griffith Show when it was like #1 or so, and they brought in Mary Tyler Moore, and they changed the whole audience basically for CBS. And this was a slight moment or two that I saw between Fred and Andy. Fred said, well, it wasn't me, it was Bob Wood. I didn't do that. It was somebody else who did it.
So we've talked a little bit about Diagnosis Murder, which was a spin-off of Jake and the Fat Man. Talk about working with Joyce Burdett, who wrote the original Diagnosis Murder episode that Jake and the original Jake and the Fat Man episode that.
No, well, Jake and the Fat Man didn't come off of Diagnosis Murder.
The other way around, sorry.
Well, yeah, because we had Dick Van Dyke. We were doing Jake and the Fat Man, and we did an episode which Joyce wrote and spun it. It was a spin-off into its own series, yeah.
So talk about working with Joyce.
Joyce is a brilliant writer. I mean, she's a novelist. She'd written a book called The Cracker Factory years ago, which had to do with a lot of her own personal problems, which got a great deal of notoriety. And she was just very smart. And initially she was brought in to sort of be Andy Griffith's writer, meaning that he'd take the meetings with her and not with us. And then she'd come back, and it was her job to kind of handle him. And I became acquainted with the facility that she had for her writing, so brought her on. She wasn't on Jake and the Fat Man, but she was on Father Dowling. She was great on Father Dowling. Joyce is like a sort of a lapsed Catholic, and so she knows a lot of the decorum and the mechanics of how the church worked, and could add things to that. And like many lapsed Catholics, has a real sense of humor about the church. So, and we did a 2-hour movie with her, which didn't go, based on a woman doctor named Elsie Georgie. So I got to know her right. And also, she and I worked on a pilot for another actress. I can't remember who it was. But I worked with Joyce a few times, yeah, on the show.
And so Diagnosis Murder was a series of movies, TV movies first.
Well, it was an odd thing. We did that, and then I think we did 3 2-hour movies, and then they scheduled it as a series. I never heard of anything like that before, but that's what we did. I think I wrote the first movie of the 3.
Right. And so it was just an unusual circumstance, and then they just decided to pick it up, or?
Yeah, I guess so. They
Yeah.
said, well, this is working, the numbers are good, and, what's not to like about Dick Van Dyke? So there we were.
And Dick's co-star on the show is Barry Van Dyke, who played Lieutenant Detective Steve Sloan, who obviously is Dick's son. So
Right.
talk about working with the father-son combination.
There was nothing special about it, in as much as they were both actors, both professionals, and there was certainly no emotional strain or Dick saying, Barry's not getting enough material. They're both very solid citizens, very professional. Dick never complains about anything, even when he should sometimes. So there wasn't any. It was a very happy relationship, and the show had a nice tone to it on the set and everything.
And you had a lot of cameo appearances by characters from classic television shows, including Rob Petrie from the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Oh yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I wasn't really that involved with that episode. I could talk about it.
Were there other guest stars on the show that stand out to you?
On Diagnosis Murder?
Yeah.
Not offhand, no.
Okay. And the show was almost canceled at the end of season 2, but it came back and was on for 8 more seasons.
Yeah.
So what changes were made after season 2 that do you think kept it going?
Nothing. It was the same show. There were some minor cast changes in supporting actor, but that isn't not going to determine anything really. No, I don't know. They just decided that they wanted to keep the show on because the show did deliver a big audience, and that was always the problem that they had. The salespeople at CBS hated the show. I mean, they didn't dislike the show. They hated having to go out to advertise it because the demos were so bad. But as I mentioned earlier, the household numbers were so big. In those household numbers, there were some good demos, and if you take it off, you might get a show that's getting an 11 share. They may be the right demos, but you don't have enough of a household to sustain it.
And the show originally shot in Denver and then came back to LA?
Yes.
Why was that decision made?
It was less expensive to shoot at Denver. I mean, and also they had a curiosity thing, which was that there had been an oil boom, I think, in the 70s at Denver, and they built a lot of high-rise buildings. And the boom went away for whatever reason. So all these empty buildings, modern buildings, that you could go in, they would be furnished. I mean, it was like having your own studio with sets that are already there. You could build sets in the basements and the loading docks. And Denver, it doesn't cost as much in Denver as it does to shoot a show here. So we started Father Dowling in Denver as well. And then once the show became more established and you wanted to have, basic sets that you could get into and out of all the time, we brought the show back here. And Viacom found a studio run by, I can't remember who, it was the Halmies, I think, owned it, which was really cheap to work with, which was up near Acton, up in that area. So they were economic decisions primarily. And of course the economic decisions had something to do with production schedules and making the show look better because you got a set and all of that.
So you talked a little bit about the work you did at Lifetime, McBride and Jane Doe and Murder 101. You mentioned that those were part of work you did for Sony International.
Well, I had written a script for CBS based on a British television series called Goodnight Sweetheart. Goodnight Sweetheart was a half-hour comedy time travel show whereupon a young guy who has a sort of sketchy marriage goes around a corner, he's in an alley, and all of a sudden he's in England during the Blitz. You never explain why. He starts a relationship with a young woman whose father owns a pub, and he goes back and forth between the two time zones, and basically he's having a relationship with two women in two different time zones. It was a half-hour show. It ran forever over there. It was very successful. My agent had gotten a hold of the project. It was brought to him because my agency at the time, Broder Curlin, represented a lot of comedy writers. And so they give it to the Charles Brothers or whomever. And these guys said, why do we want a British show? We'll create our own show. So there was no market for it. But he showed it to me, and I said, you know, this doesn't have to be a half hour, because when he goes over to the Blitz, when he's in that segment, you can do melodramas. And you can do a little ragtime. You could put Jack Kennedy there because Joe Kennedy was the ambassador. So I went in to CBS and I pitched it, and they commissioned a script, and I did the script and it went over, and the script was a big hit at CBS. I got phone calls from people I didn't even know, and I thought, this is great. So then it gets shown to Les Moonves, and she calls me back. She said, Les likes the format, but he doesn't like the story that's inside the format. I thought, well, I've got to do this. But if they don't like the second script as much as they like the first script, it's dead. They're going to say it has no legs. But I don't have any choice. So I write, another script goes over. They like it even more. Then she says to me, we're not going to produce it. I said, why not? She said, to bring Les Moonves over from Warner Brothers, we had put pilot deals in place, and one of them is a time travel show. So we're not going to make your pilot. But on the basis of that, they renewed a show called Early Edition, which was made by Columbia TriStar, it was called at the time. And there was a lot of tumult on the show, the production. It was kind of a mess, basically, and kind of a little out of control. So they said to my agent, they said to TriStar, we'll renew the show if you bring Dean in. So they brought me in, and I started working on the show. And then the guy who was the original showrunner in the show, who seemed to be happy to get out of there, after about 6 episodes decided he wanted to come back. And it was not an easy show to do. It was a very difficult format. And so as it turned out, he'd been Les Moonves' roommate when they were back in New York doing theater, and Les had brought him out here. So even though he had said goodbye, he said, well, I really like it back. So they said, well, you know, we're gonna bring him back to let him run the show. But at that particular time, they had some need for somebody to go to Europe to be their executive producer on television series and movies that they were deficit financing. So the guy who was running production on the series said to me, how would you like to go to Germany on a fact-finding mission? I said, when? So I went over there, and so they had an on-the-air commitment for a German network for 12 episodes, which in Europe is huge. And it was about a woman forensic, a medical examiner, and called Silent Witness, which I'm looking at this and I said, this is a British show. I followed this show in England. It's the same show. I said, you can't do this. Do you have the rights to this? They said, no. I said, well, you're going to have to change the show or get the rights. Ultimately, they changed the show, and they paid some money to the British people. And now I start over, and they said, we have a bunch of stories. And they had a development staff of about 3 or 4 people. We have 50 stories. I said, great. I'm wondering, what am I doing here? And they'd say, murder at a racetrack, murder at a YMCA. And they go through this long list, and then they had a bunch of Quincy episodes they were going to steal. And I said, you know, first of all, these aren't stories. They're sort of arenas. And you can't take Quincy episodes. You're stealing from people. So this all, I got a couple of writers and sent over to work on the show. And then Sony started sending me to other venues. I worked in Brazil. I worked in Argentina. I had a show in Spain, which got aborted. We were actually in pre-production, and the broadcaster changed hands and decided they didn't want to make any 2 hours. I did a series in Italy. I worked for about 8 years in London, and I was exec producer on, I don't know, 2 or 3 series and a couple of movie series. And it was a great job because, you know, you're over there kind of working with people who know what they're doing and you can kind of help out. And fortunately, they were all very welcoming. You know, I was afraid when I got there that they're going to say, who needs him, right? But I became good friends with them and worked with them, and they're still friends of mine. And it was a great gig. And I was with Sony for about 10 years doing that kind of material, running around for them.
Oh, that sounds great.
It was wonderful.
So let's talk a bit about the craft of writing.
Okay.
What do you like about writing?
Well, I like the process. You know, I like to invent something that amuses me, you know, or that I think, hey, that's pretty good. My point of view about craft is that there's a separation. There was a writer named Laios Egri when I first started who wrote a book called The Art of Dramatic Writing, which was on everybody's bookshelf. He had a dialectic where he used the Ibsen well-made play as an example for you to use as a template, as a writer. And as he said, I can show you how to write a well-made play. It may not be any good, but I can show you how to do that. So I took some lessons from him and kind of absorbed what I could. And then I started writing. I started getting jobs, you know, so as I kind of went through earlier in this conversation.
So what
There's a craft. There's a definite craft to writing, and there's also an art. So some people can be very good craftsmen, but they're not that, the material isn't that satisfying.
What do you like about writing mysteries in particular?
Well, I like character. If I can come up with a character, or you know, and work on a character, doing the mystery is secondary. That's the least fun of all because it's, you know, you're working. It's like you're dealing with machinery at that point. The fun is to take a character and get some mileage out of it. I had a project at the Hallmark Channel, which had been greenlit just days before the strike. And I had Bob Newhart starring in it, and I was going to direct it. And it was based on the fact that there is in London, at Scotland Yard, a thing called the Black Museum, which has memorabilia from Jack the Ripper and all these various cases. And I knew a guy who knew somebody there, because they don't let civilians in. And this is years ago, so I got to go in and see the sergeant who ran it. And I show up, and he'd forgotten that I was coming in. He said, well, I don't have time for you. And I said, well, I've come from Los Angeles. And well, okay, 10 minutes. I'm just going to give you a look. I go in there. I'm there for 2 hours because he can't stop talking about all of this stuff, most of which is fascinating. So I incorporated that idea into an LA crime museum, basically, which Bob Newhart would be running. And I asked the guy at the one in London, I said, do they ever call you in on cases? He said, yes, they do. When forensics doesn't work, they sometimes need deduction. He said, there was a case recently where I'm called in, a man has been struck from behind, he survived, he's in the hospital, he didn't see who struck him, and we're at a loss to figure out who did this to him. He said, so I go over and I look at the guy, I look at the x-rays, and I say, is there an antique dealer involved in this case? And they said, yes. I said, is he involved in military antiques? They said, yes. He's your man. And he reached over a table and he picked up a mace, which had been used in World War I by the French, which had a round ball at the end of a chain and a handle. And the protrusions on this ball matched exactly in the x-rays of the guy who got struck from behind. I stole this immediately when I was writing the thing for Bob. So anyway, we were greenlit, and then all of a sudden we weren't, and then the strike went on forever. Bob's wife became ill. Fortunately, she's well now. And so by the time we got back, it was just kind of over. You know, they fired all the executives and they're bringing in new people. It just kind of drifted. I'd even written a second script, but it didn't happen.
That's too bad. That sounds like a great show.
Well, I thought it was going to be really amusing because you got Bob Newhart, you know. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Can't go wrong with that. So how much do the specific actors you're writing for, like a Bob Newhart or, Dick Van Dyke, how much does that actor, it being that actor, influence the words that you're writing?
Well, to a great deal. Everyone has a pattern, of speech or a distinctive style. I mean, you can't write the same dialogue for Andy Griffith as you can for Bob Newhart. I mean, it's just completely different.
And you started your career as a comedy writer, as we've discussed, and humor seems to be an important thread throughout your work. So talk about your brand of humor.
I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to that question because I just kind of write what amuses me. I'm not fond of broad humor. I'm not fond of a lot of humor which relies upon salacious material or toilet humor or really broad material. I'd like to think that what I do is consistent with the character that I'm writing for, and to some extent will make people smile. They may not laugh, but they make people smile and make it enjoy. If I could wish for what I'm writing, I would wish for it to be droll.
And do you have a writing process? Do you outline, write by hand?
I write by hand, yeah. I use the yellow tablet. And then I go to the computer. It took me a long time to get into computers.
You used a typewriter?
Yeah, I used a typewriter or the yellow pad. 'Cause too many times in the office I'd hear people screaming that the computer had eaten their third act. So I was skeptical for quite a while.
Yeah, they were a little tricky in the beginning.
Yeah.
And do you have a daily routine that you follow?
Well, now I don't really, because I'm writing and doing things sporadically, and I'm doing different things, like putting together this tap dance thing in New York, or I'm working on a thing with my brother, and we have to figure out what time to do what. It's a little scattered at the moment. I mean, obviously you're doing a show. You get up in the morning early, and you get out there and you work, and your day is pretty solidly, structured for you.
And did you have any rituals when you were writing on a more regular basis that you always followed?
You mean satanic?
Yeah, you can talk about those.
Okay. No, not really. I mean, a lot of writers have them. I mean, I've known writers who had to have certain colored pens that they worked on and this and that. I don't think I have any rituals. Maybe I do and I don't know it.
Did you ever use a pseudonym?
No, I never did. There's a couple of scripts that I read I wish I had. Because I wrote a script very early on, which I sold to David Susskind, who was a very important producer back in New York. And this is before I had any jobs at all. I'd written this script, and I knew he stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And so I go over there, and he's having breakfast, and I go up to him, introduce myself, and hand him the script. And he graciously took it. And then the next thing I know, 2 days later, he calls me, and he options it like that. It never got made. And I worked for David, then I went back there and I worked with some projects with him. And ultimately, his movie career started to fade. I came back here. And then one day, a couple of years ago, I said, I looked at the script and I said, this is really terrible. I don't know what he had in mind. So I burned it. I didn't want anybody to see it.
Don't leave a trace of your...
Yeah.
Because the Writers Guild had that, in 1974 you wrote a TV movie called Lady Luck, and that there was like a Matlock credit that you were credited under the name J.L. Henderson.
That's possible. I don't remember. I don't know why I would do that.
Yeah.
I can't answer that.
So when did you join?
That was my grandfather, my maternal grandfather,
okay.
yeah.
So there's a link to that name.
Yeah, but I don't remember doing that.
Do you remember the TV movie Lady Luck? Does that strike a
I
bell?
don't remember the movie.
Yeah.
I remember doing it.
Yeah. When did you join the Writers Guild?
Well, it must have been around 1961, I think. It's when I went on the Newhart show. I joined it. It was 61, 62, whenever I went on then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had that it was the 63 when you wrote The Wine Dark Sea for Kraft Suspense Theater, but Newhart would have been before that.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did you first become aware of the Guild?
Well, you know, it's there, it's important, and you know, you learn right away that you have to be a member. And so, and the Guild does some very wonderful things, mostly, I think, in the area of credits. You know, credits are the lifeblood of any performer or writer, and they protect your credits very thoroughly and very aggressively.
Are there any other benefits, do you think, of membership?
Oh, well, yes, they have a very good pension plan, they have health and welfare. I mean, it's a very good union. I have a lot of issues with the things they go to strike over. I feel that, I mean, Stephen Bochco once said that he'd spent an entire year of his career on strike, and I fall into that category too. And in my opinion, nothing really came out of any of those strikes. I don't need to detail, I don't want to detail that now, but I find that if I'm going to listen to somebody, it's the Directors Guild. The Directors Guilds are usually the ones who are business oriented. I remember, because I'm a member of the Directors Guild, one year I went to the strike meeting at the Writers Guild, and there's 20 guys lined up at the microphone to make whatever they think. And you go to the Directors Guild and they say, we may go on strike, and all you see are calculators coming out and doing that. And then they say, okay, you know, because they deal in numbers. Many of them are production managers and things like that. So it's a much more business-like guild than the Writers Guild is. The Writers Guild can be run on emotion. Best Writers Guild story that I know was that in 1960, the Writers Guild decided that they wanted what the Dramatists Guild has in New York, which is a percentage of the gross of a production. They went out they were out for 6 months trying to get this. Lou Wasserman, who was heading up the committee for negotiation, hated residuals anyway, because his attitude was, I paid for this once, why do I have to pay for it again? So they went into these long discussions. We were out for I was actually before I was in, but they went out for 6 months and they finally got what was called the Wasserman Plan. And the Wasserman Plan was they would get 4% of the gross in perpetuity on anything that they wrote. And they signed the deal. They felt it was a great victory, forgetting the fact that a network gets 2 runs of a show for a license fee. And most writers relied on that second run for their summer rerun money. Now it doesn't exist anymore. You're only going to get that 4% when it goes into syndication. They had to threaten to go back on strike 3 years later to get back their old deal. I'm one of the few people who benefited from that, because The Man from U.N.C.L.E. ran everywhere. And as a matter of fact, I still get a couple of $1,000s a year off of residuals from The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And that's for what, 1964? How long ago was that? 50 some years ago. But most people that didn't have to, because most comedies don't translate overseas because our comedy's so verbal. So they had to fight to get their old deal back.
How would you describe your producing style?
Well, I like to think that I delegate. At the same time, I'm very hands-on. If there's a dispute, my line is, this is not a democracy. So, in fact, my old producer said, well, you know, with Dean, he says, he'll say, do it your way, and we will, and then he'll do it his way. So, yeah, I mean, I feel, you know, the buck stops here. That's my job, you know, is to be the final arbiter. I'd like to think that I make it accessible for people to do what they do best, and I like good ideas from anywhere they might arrive. I suppose everybody thinks that, quite frankly, but which I've done, is to describe my style. I guess that'd be it. That's what I'd like it to be anyway. I'd like it to be perceived that way even more.
And how do you think being a writer affected your producing style?
I don't know the answer to that, actually. I don't think it did, because I've written on so many different kinds of programs, and I think my producing style, if that's the right word, is the same on all of them.
So we just have a handful more questions to sum up.
Okay.
Um,
And then I'd like to make a 12-minute speech.
Please.
No, I'm just kidding.
Please.
No.
We got nothing but time. Have you had any mentors throughout your career?
Roland Kibbe was my mentor. He was a genius on constructing a script. And he also had a great sense of humor. So we, collaborations are odd things. You can never figure out who does what or that. And in my experience, if I had to define it, I'd say, no matter how different you are, and Kibbe and I couldn't have been more separate or more different as people, if you can come together on what you think is good, that's the solution. That's really all it takes. You can be totally different opposites.
How do you think television has changed since you started in the industry?
Well, I think the advent of digital, cable is huge. I mean, at one time when I started, there were 3 networks. And if you got a 30 share, you stayed on the air, and if you didn't, you might go away. Then they started the Fox network, which ate up a lot of independent stations, which cut into your ability to syndicate shows, particularly hour shows. It's hard to find a spot for them, not so much for half hours. And I think because the studios lost their power greatly when the FinCEN rule came about, when networks are now allowed to produce and there were limitations. You can't separate a network from a studio. They all have their studios. And I think that made a huge difference. And I think it created more anxiety on the part of broadcasters. So they don't stay with a show for very long. I mean, if it doesn't work, it'll be gone right away. And there's legendary stories of shows like All in the Family and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, who looked like great failures. I remember when All in the Family went on, the head of the studio, I happened to be around the time, he says, well, it's a disaster. He said, well, guess what?
So we at the Television Academy Foundation have been conducting these oral history interviews for over 20 years. What do you think is the value of preserving these personal behind-the-scenes stories from within the industry?
Well, I think it's a great learning process. I mean, everybody who comes into this at some point is coming in new, and having the ability to find people who did the kind of work that they aspire to do, I think is invaluable. I think it's a great thing that you're doing. And I don't know how many, I think you quoted me like 900 or something.
Yeah, over 900 now.
Over 900. It's really remarkable. And also the fact that you deal with methodology, I think is very, very important, because, using myself as, I had no idea what I was doing, Fortunately, I kind of figured it out, and I had a mentor here and there. So I think it's invaluable for new people. And I think also it's going to make accessible to people of color and diversity to have access to this kind of material, which they're not going to have in their normal lives through the kind of education that they're confined to. So I think that's a huge benefit. And I hope that you're able to promote this enough to get people to come in and look at it.
So what advice would you give to an aspiring writer?
Well, I've had this question before, and I always have the same answer. I call it getting out of the corner. Because you're going to get out and you're going to get knocked down. You have to have the ability to get back up and come out again. I mean, Billy Wilder, one of the most successful writer-producers in history, had a 3-to-1 ratio, one hit for every 3 movies that he made. But the people who persevere, I think perseverance is really the single greatest attribute that you can have. I mean, you either have the talent and you've learned your craft or not. But even when you have, you're going to get knocked down a lot, no matter how good you are or how good the project is. And you have to be able to get up and get out of the corner again.
And would you give the same advice to an aspiring producer?
Well, I suppose, I guess perseverance kind of works for everybody to some extent. Um, Somebody once said, a producer is someone who knows a writer. And that's not entirely true. It's kind of a writer's favorite, admonition. But producing is so much different because you have people who are, in England they call them jobbing producers, producers for hire, who can come in and do the mechanical part of producing. You have people who put together films and projects. I mean, if you look at a film and it says executive producer, chances are he's a manager or he got the money together. If it said producer, you hope that he actually did some producing on the picture. So I wouldn't know what advice to give to them, because with producing it's so different. And like I said earlier, with the proliferation of credits, it's very difficult to know who did what, which is why the term showrunner came about. Because you could have a half a dozen producers on a show, and somebody's going to say, yeah, but who's running the show? And so that's the best I can do for that.
What's your proudest career achievement?
Well, I'd say surviving, but on the one hand. No, I've had a nice career. I've done some things that I'm very proud of, like Columbo and other things. And a few things I'm glad aren't around anymore to be viewed. I feel that I've had a very solid career, particularly as a craftsman. One of the things I take pride in is being, from my friend Kibbe, who really taught me, is the craft of writing screenplays. Can't teach talent, but you can teach craft. I have some hostility to some of these guys who run lectures and invite people in and use Casablanca as the touchstone for becoming a writer, which is odd because Casablanca, if you've ever read about it as a picture, nobody knew what it was about up to the end. And so, there was another guy who was a Charlie somebody, where they had these classes that, and I remember I once ran into an executive on a project I was doing for NBC, and he said, well, something has to happen for 6 minutes. I said, why? Well, I went to this class, and I wound up changing that with him, but everybody's looking for the magic key for everything, and there isn't any.
Do you have any career regrets?
Yeah, I have one, and I hesitate to mention it because I've had a very, very blessed life. I've had a great deal of luck, and I've done some good work, and I don't have much, as I say, baseball's been good to me. But I suppose the only regret I ever think is that I didn't take more chances with my talent. Television was a business. There is no movie business. There are no movies that have to be made, but there is television that has to be made. And it's very seductive when you're doing well just to keep working in television, except for the Manchu Eagle, which I'm going to give you a copy if you promise to watch it.
I promise. I can't wait to watch it.
Yeah, it's only 74 minutes long.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I can't wait to watch it.
Yeah. So I wish I'd taken more chances with my talent. I don't know that I would have succeeded, I may have been just sitting around a park somewhere now wondering what all happened. But other than that, I can't possibly have any regrets. I've had I've had a lot of sunshine in my life, and I'm very happy and fortunate to have it. As I say, I've got this beautiful home. I never dreamed in my life coming out of Gas City, Kansas, that I'm going to live like this. It was so foreign to me. The first time I bought a home in this kind of neighborhood, I was dumbfounded that I could talk about these kind of figures. It just couldn't ever happen. So I've been very lucky at that. I worked hard, and I feel I've done my job, but I often wonder, what if I'd done what a lot of guys did, like Phil Kaufman, or Francis Coppola, or guys, or Marty Scorsese, and that, who went out and just took their talent and took gambles and chances and fought and saw their way through to making the kind of films they wanted to make. That's my only regret. And it's a regret I would never have mentioned except you asked me, because I don't have the right to regret anything. I'm very happy with my life.
In 2015, you directed and executive produced the documentary Tap World, which it expanded upon the short film you had done called Tap Heat. So why did you want to make that documentary?
Well, they're very dissimilar. One thing, Tap Heat is on YouTube, by the way. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not. And I don't know if Tap World's on there, but I know Tap World's on Amazon, it's around. Tap Heat, as I'd mentioned earlier, I was sitting around my lush hotel room saying, I didn't go to film school to do this. And so I got the idea about doing that. I did the short film. And then I shot a lot of other tap stuff, just kind of extraneously, thinking maybe I'll find some way to make all this into something. And I became in love with the tap form and with the people in it. It's a great community of artists. And so then I wanted to do one, but I'm going to tell you how much it cost me to make Tap Heat, but it's rather stunning. And I had no idea I was going to spend this kind of money. So I thought, well, I'd like to do another one that's different than Tap Heat, because Tap Heat, as slighted as it is, has a narrative. There's a very hip young dancer, an old dancer. They do a challenge, they do a number, and that's all it is. It's all about the dance, there's no dialogue. But I wanted to do something about international tap around the world, global tap. So I got these two producers, sister tap dancers who are my friends, and they were keen and up for this thing. So it was actually a social media project, because we put the word out to dancers all over the world that we're going to make this film. It's going to be dancers' stories. Send us your film, take your best shot, and it's a contest. And if you win the contest, you're in the film. So we got film from over 100 places, from all over the place, and narrowed it down, I think, to maybe 15 or something like that. And the hard part was cutting stuff out, because you had to weigh it basically on their stories, because the skill level of the dancers is all consistent, is very high. But sometimes you have to say, well, this story is too similar to that story, so we can't do that. And my first cut was 2 hours long. And I had remembered something that I'd heard years ago. There was a famous director, Broadway director, who said, everything in show business is 20 minutes too long. So I've lived by this world as long as I could. And so I took it down and got it down to 73, 74 minutes. And you have to lose stuff. And another guy said to me, the thing about documentaries is they're never finished. And I'm already really locking this up, and somebody sends me some footage about 2 tap dancing priests at the Vatican. I'm looking at this film. I said, I can't tear this apart and start over and put this in. So, well, if I ever do anything else, I'll have to look these guys up.
Sequel.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of it out there, but and doing it, there was a little sort of narrative to Tap Heat. There's nothing. I'm just collecting dances, and I have to watch this. And said to my editor, I said, "What's this about?" And finally, we noticed a theme that kept recurring with the dancers, which is rhythm, and taking rhythm and extrapolating that from your heartbeat to your life to dance. And that's the little theme that's threaded through that. And that's what kind of holds it together.
That's beautiful. And so one final question is, how would you like to be remembered?
Oh. Well, I'd like to be, I never thought about this before. I don't know if I want to think about it, quite frankly. Legacy implies events that may not too far down the road that I don't really want to dwell on. But I don't know. I'd like to be remembered as an honest writer-producer. And the most honest writer-producer I've ever known was a guy named Stephen J. Cannell, whom you've all known. When we were at Universal together as contract players, when you left at the end of the day, his car was still there. When you came in the morning, his car was still there. He was the most honest, hardworking, good writer I've ever met, who worked in the factory like we all do. And I always admired him for that, and it was sad that he died so young, because he still had a lot of things he could have done. He moved over to novels. He was successful at that. He was a great and generous man in many ways, And I just admired him. I thought, this is the kind of guy I'd like to be remembered like him, remembered well. Because there are too many people I know who aren't going to be remembered very well. And I won't name them. But I suppose that's it.
Well, you will be remembered well, for sure, and thank you so much for sitting down and talking to us.
Oh, not at all. I'm flattered. This was great.
Oh, it was an honor
Yeah.
to get to do it.
Yeah, well, thank you guys, for sitting through all of this and doing it.
It was
Just
great.
make me look 20 years younger, and I'll be very happy.